Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this online Wes Talk organised by John Wesley's New Room in Bristol in partnership with the Methodist Church's Learning Network South West. I'm Mandy Briggs and I'm the Education Officer here. John Wesley's New Room is the oldest Methodist building in the world. Situated in Bristol city centre, John Wesley called the chapel a light in the city and used it as a base for his work. In 2017, a new visitor centre opened on the site, which features a new revamped museum, cafe, shop, library, and meeting rooms. Behind the scenes is my colleague Louise Ratton, who will be heading up the technical side of the talk tonight. Just a few notes as we begin. Please note that this talk is being recorded. During the talk, you'll be able to see and hear our speakers as they talk, but your own video and audio will be turned off. If you have particular questions that you would like to ask our speakers, please save them for question time towards the end of our hour together, when we'll ask you to write your questions into the Q&A facility, and you can access this by clicking Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen, not chat, definitely Q&A. The title of this Wes Talk is Earn, Save, Give, John Wesley's Advice on Money. John Wesley was well known for trying to live simply. His motto was earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can. But how do we understand this advice today, and does it still work? With these thoughts and questions in mind, I'd like to welcome our two speakers this evening. First of all, welcome to Gary Best. Gary is the historical consultant at John Wesley's New Room and was instrumental in creating the new visitor centre and the award-winning museum here. He taught history for many years and has written widely on Methodist topics, including biographies of Charles Wesley, Grace Murray, and John Kennick, and a history of the New Room entitled The Cradle of Methodism. He's also the author of the book Slavery in Bristol, which explores Bristol's role in the trading of enslaved people. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to Karen Davies, who is the Chief Executive of Purple Shoots, a limited company based in South Wales, which described itself as a financial institution for people held back by circumstances. I'm very much looking forward to finding out a little bit more about what that means. Thank you both for joining us this evening. Don't forget that if you are an attendee, you will have a chance to ask questions at the end of Karen and Gary's presentations by using the Q&A button. So without further ado, I would like to hand over first of all to Gary, who is going to speak to us a bit about John Wesley's advice on money. Gary, it's over to you. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's a delight to be able to speak to you this evening about Wesley and about his views on money. I think most of us probably know where our next meal is going to come from, but there are millions of people in the world, of course, who don't know where their next meal is going to come from. Our cupboards tend to be full of clothes and various other things of possessions which we may or may not use. But there are many people, of course, who don't even have enough clothes to wear. And we tend to forget that there are lots of people in want because we make our focus our own home, our own lifestyle, our own comfort, our own holidays. And we buy ourselves into a world of advertising, which targets our own selfish desires, our desire to look beautiful, our desire to wear the latest fashions, our wish for a good time. And it's just very easy to forget that a good time is not possible for many, many people. And against that background, I think it is worth looking at what Wesley had to say, because even though he was speaking in the 18th century, actually he was addressing that very issue, the same issues, in fact, that exist today. Mandy's made reference to what he's frequently quoted as saying, which is gain all you can, save all you can, and give all you can. But that phrase has been frequently misinterpreted. And before I go, just to say briefly what actually it means, it's perhaps worth saying a little bit about Wesley's views on money. First of all, he didn't believe that money was evil. He says, the love of money we know is the root of evil, but not the thing itself. The fault does not lie in the money, but in them that use it. It may be used ill, but it likewise may be used well. It's an excellent gift of God, answering the noblest ends. In the hands of his children, it is food for the hungry, drink for the thirsty, raiment for the naked. It gives to the traveller and the stranger where to lay his head. By it we may supply the place of a husband to the widow, and of a father to the fatherless. We may be a defence for the oppressed, a means of health to the sick, of ease to them that are in pain. It may be as eyes to the blind, as feet to the lame, a lifter up from the gates of death. Note in that bit from him, the word that it's a gift. As far as he was concerned, people got it wrong in thinking that they earned their money. His focus was that we only earn money because we've got certain talents, certain gifts, certain abilities. And all those gifts and talents and abilities have been given to us by God. And so for that reason, we're not the real earners of the money. God is the person who helps us earn the money. And the money is basically God's. We are just, if you like, trustees of it or stewards of it. And so we're supposed to be using the money we earn primarily in God's service. Again, to quote him, do you not know that God entrusted you with that money to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to help the stranger, the widow, the fatherless, and indeed, as far as it will go, to relieve the wants of all mankind? How can you, how dare you defraud God by applying it to any other purpose? So it's against that background, I want to turn to that first phrase, gain all you can. Because when Wesley said that, it was about gaining as much as you can in order to help as much as you can. It's not about becoming rich for our own benefit. He thought any pursuit of wealth just for the sake of its own wealth was actually sinful. It meant he thought we had the wrong priorities. We were focused on getting what we want rather than on helping other people. We'd become lovers of money rather than lovers of God. And displaying wealth through fancy clothes or possessions, he felt not only corrupted us, but it corrupted other people because it encouraged them to think that acquiring wealth to spend on ourselves is actually what is desirable. And in other words, it was like he said, it was poisoning our minds to think in that kind of way. It's not about being rich for our own benefit. And it's interesting when Wesley defines what it means to be rich, he actually says, you are rich if you've got enough to eat, if you've got enough clothes to put on, and you've got a place where you can lay your head. That's enough to be rich. Beyond that, beyond those necessities, the priority should be to actually be helping others with the money that you've gained. And given his focus on helping people, it's not surprising that Wesley had actually quite strong views on the ways in which you should earn money. He didn't think that you should, well, there's three things I can say about that. First of all, he thought that money was not worth endangering your life or your health for. He says, we ought not to gain money at the expense of life, nor at the expense of our health. No gain whatever should induce us to enter into or to continue in any employment which will impair our constitution. Neither should we begin or continue in any business which necessarily deprives us of proper seasons for food and sleep. So in other words, there was a limitation on the expectations of work for money. Secondly, he said that money shouldn't be acquired by cheating or lying or disobeying the rules. He says, we may not engage or continue in any sinful trade that's contrary to the law of God or contrary to our country, or to engage in any business, he says, that cannot be maintained unless it involves cheating or lying or conforming to some custom which isn't consistent with a good conscience. Summarizing that, he says, to gain money, we must not lose our souls. And thirdly, he says money should not be acquired by hurting others. And he gives lots of examples of what he means by that. You shouldn't sell anything, for example, he says, that you know will harm somebody's health. You shouldn't lay on entertainment that you know will encourage immorality. You shouldn't engage in gambling. You shouldn't deliberately seek to ruin a competitor. You shouldn't seek to profiteer from the treatment of people who require help, and so on and so on. Money shouldn't, he felt, be acquired by ways in which you are actually hurting people. And most famously, of course, he applied that to the institution of slavery and became a great opposer of the slave trade. And just to give one small quotation on that, he says, better no trade than trade produced by villainy. Better is honest poverty than all the riches bought by the tears and the sweat and the blood of our fellow creatures. So there's a morality behind Wesley's talk about what are gaining money. And then that next phrase, saving money. And again, it's a phrase that's often misinterpreted. What Wesley meant by that, I think, were two things. First of all, that you should save money rather than frittering away money. You shouldn't just spend money when there's no need to spend it. He says, don't throw your money away on idle expenses. You might as well, he says, throw it into the sea as do that. Don't expend it to gratify the desire of the flesh, the desire of the eye, or the pride of life. And he goes on to say that actually, if you look at people who are very rich, often they're very unhappy. It doesn't make them happy, the fact they've got lots of money and lots of possessions. And it's false. It's a false assumption that by spending things, we will make ourselves happy. Today, we talk about retail therapy, for example, as if somehow that's going to make us happy. Wesley wouldn't have agreed with that. He says, in seeking happiness from riches, you're striving to drink out of empty cups. And let them be painted and gilded ever so finely, they are still empty. So when he talks about saving, it's not just about not frittering it away. He does accept that you need to save some money for your family. He says a family has to have something to fall back on if anything were to happen. There was some crisis. You need some money to fall back on. And he knew that from personal experience because his own father had been imprisoned for debt. And his mother and his brothers and sisters had suffered quite badly at that time because the father was in prison. And he spoke a lot about avoiding debt and the problems that debt generated once you'd fallen into it. And he applied that even to businesses. I mean, he says to business owners that they should be very careful about how they apply their business so they don't overcommit themselves. But he didn't confuse that kind of saving with hoarding lots of money. He certainly didn't approve of saving money for the inheritance of your children. He actually says the worst use of money is to accumulate it for posterity. He says, leave them enough to live on, not in idleness and luxury, but by honest industry. And he says, you know, if you don't have children, what's the point of collecting all this money and hoarding it away? It's not going to do you any good. Hoarding money simply means you're not actually helping others as much as you can. And that, of course, takes me to give all you can. Wesley repeatedly says, we need to spend on ourselves enough to meet what he called the necessities of life. And by that, he meant simple food, sensible clothes, reasonable shelter. But he then says, cut off all the rest of the expense. Despise delicacy and variety. Be content with what plain nature requires. Waste no part of your money on adorning your house, in superfluous or expensive furniture, in costly pictures, in paintings, gildings, books, in elegant rather than useful gardens, and so on. And he certainly says we should avoid spending too much money on our children. He says, why should you purchase for them more pride or lust or vanity or foolish and hurtful desires? Why should you be at further expense to increase their temptations and their snares? The main purpose of the money that you earned, the money that you saved, is to help other people. Are you a human being, he says, and then you should have a human heart. Don't you ever feel another's pain? Have you no sympathy, no sense of human woe, no pity for the miserable? Has gold entirely blinded your eyes and stupefied your heart? And there's a very memorable phrase, which if you remember nothing for what I've said, perhaps just remember this one phrase from Wesley. He says, what should rise is not the Christian's standard of living, but his standard of giving. What should rise is not the Christian's standard of living, but his standard of giving. And just one final point, which I think I ought to make. Wesley didn't think that money was a substitute for personally engaging with people in need. Whilst we should be giving as much money as we can, he strongly, strongly believed that you needed to physically engage with the poor and the sick and the imprisoned, not just provide money. And he thought that for a variety of reasons. I think partly because he felt that actually you really only understood the problems that people were facing if you had either direct experience of those or you were engaging closely with people who had direct experience of them. And that first-hand experience, he felt, would help transform your approach. It would make you better appreciate the pressures that people are under. It would make you more genuinely concerned about their welfare. It would make you more appreciative of what you had and be willing to share it with them. You would become, he felt, less judgmental, and you'd help others ultimately, not out of a sense of duty, but because you really wanted to help them. There's a very interesting exchange of letters between him and a very rich lady who clearly didn't want to go and mix with the poor and the hungry and the sick and the imprisoned, and was very worried about going into the slum areas. And he says to her, go and see the poor and sick in their hovels. Take up your cross, woman, he says. Remember that Jesus went before you. Creep in amongst them in spite of all the dirt, he says, in spite of 100 disgusting circumstances. Just don't confine your conversation to the genteel and the elegant. And he goes on to say, there's a necessity in terms of actually personal contact. And of course, that's reflected in the famous mantra that kind of sums up Wesley's approach, which is to do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, and as long as ever you can. And then I think I've just got time for one final point. Wesley believed that there was a joy that came from helping people. And that joy was a much deeper joy than you got by any other method. He actually saw helping people as a way on which you received God's grace. Helping others helped not just them, it actually helped you. He felt you would experience God empowering you. He felt you would experience God changing you for the better. It would make you more like the person you really longed to be. And interestingly, for that reason, Wesley didn't just ask the well-off to give help. He actually also called on the poor to help others from their very limited means as much as they were able. Because he said, while you help others, God will help you. And I think I've probably run out of time. I could say a bit more about poverty and dealing with poverty, but I'll stop there and I can take some questions on that later. Or on Wesley's personal example that he set, because he did set a remarkable example in terms of his attitude towards money and towards how he helped people. But I think I better stop because of my time has run out.
That's fine, Gary, thank you. I might ask you about that a bit more later, because that sounds really, really interesting. But yes, let's hand over now to Karen, who's going to tell us a little bit about her work in contemporary society. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for having me. I've brought some slides just because it's something else to look at rather than just my face and my line of friends that are behind me here. So I'm going to share my screen and walk you through those. So hold on a sec. I'm one of these technically challenged people. Okay, that hopefully you can all see that now. Mandy, I'm sure will tell me if you can't. So yes, Purple Shoes is a charity based in Wales that I started almost 10 years ago now. We don't present ourselves as a Christian organisation per se, but everybody who works for Purple Shoots is a deeply committed Christian. And this is what we set up Purple Shoots to do, this very grand aim of tackling poverty, unemployment, financial exclusion by encouraging entrepreneurship and independence. We do it in two key ways. One is microfinance. Now, if you, some of you may well know the story of where microfinance came from, but I will tell it really quickly in case not. It comes from the Far East. There was a professor in Bangladesh called Muhammad Yunus who was interested in studying poverty at closer quarters and moved into a poor village somewhere in Bangladesh and expected to find people sort of sinking into despair, struggling with to make ends meet. What he found was the opposite. He found a hive of activity, people ducking and diving, running multiple businesses, trying to make ends meet with their own entrepreneurial skills, but not managing to do it because in order to get these businesses off the ground, they were borrowing money, and the only people who would lend them money were people who charged enormous interest rates. And so any money they made on their businesses went in paying these people the interest and paying them back. So he just lent them some of his own money and discovered that actually broke that cycle. They paid him back. He didn't charge much interest. They paid him back, but it broke that cycle. It meant that the businesses they ran started to actually earn them some money and started to build them a pathway out of the poverty that they were in. And that inspired him to start the Grameen Bank, which was one of the first, the first bank that lent solely to the very poor people, the very poorest people in the Bangladeshi communities. It's been copied around the world, and it's been copied with less success in the developed world, and which is, we don't really know why, but I think it's to do with the way the business is more complicated in the UK. You can't just wheel up a bicycle and start selling stuff. You need insurance and all this sort of thing. There's various reasons why. I think one of the principal reasons why it hasn't worked is because of our drive always for profit in the financial services industry. And it's very difficult to do this and make money from it. Purple Shoots is a charity because we're not expecting to make money from it. But that's one of the key things we do. So we lend money to people who are wanting to start a business but just can't get the money from anywhere else. In the UK only. In fact, until recently, only in Wales, but we are trying to expand, and we've recently opened an office in Yorkshire, and we're about to do a little pilot in the southwest as well. The other thing we do is self-reliant groups, which are linked to the microfinance. They're a way of getting people together who are maybe further away from being able to start a business. Because when we started Purple Shoots, what we found was that there were plenty of people who were trying to start a business and trying to change their circumstances and just needed a bit of money to get that business off the ground. But then we realized that there were other people who had skills and abilities, but maybe were further away from that, from just needing money, but needed some other support or some other sort of upskilling or something to get them closer to being more independent and in better financial circumstances. So that's what the groups do. They get people together, they help them to, they build friendships first, and then they start sort of sharing skills, swapping skills, developing ideas for changing their lives, moving forward in some way. So when I'm talking with policymakers, I tell them that we're contributing to the levelling up agenda, because the businesses that we start create wealth in local economies, because they tend to be small businesses that serve the local economy. So they buy their supplies locally, they employ local people, the money they earn is spent locally. So it kind of benefits the communities the people are coming from. So there's sort of a double gain from doing this sort of thing. Well, that's one of our self-reliant groups. I popped that in. That's just to show you that this is one of the self-reliant groups that has actually become an independent business. It's a group made up of people, some with additional needs and some able-bodied people, and they run pop-up cafes. And they've actually taken over this. They're pictured here in the canteen of the fire service headquarters in Llantrisant, which they run now. And obviously, several of the people in that picture you can see would struggle to get any sort of mainstream job, but they can work here. So that's a great outcome. So just to blow Purple Shoot trumpet, this is what we've achieved in the last 9 or so years. With a very small team, there's 1.5 of us that do the lending, and it just turns things around for the people who get the loan, people who are struggling on the benefit system. I can't get out of it. This is the trigger that helps them to move forward. You can see that we give a 10 times benefit to the community. That's in terms of money spent in the community, taxes paid, etc. And actually, there's a net gain to Treasury of £3 to £4 for every £1 we lend. Again, in benefits saved and taxes paid. So it's definitely worth doing, and we are currently the only people doing it because it's difficult to do and difficult to fund. There are hundreds of verses in the Bible about poverty. I picked on 2 because I thought I might, as it's a as it's a Christian context, just to talk a little bit about the why. Although I think Gary has explained really why we should be doing this, but personally, I think I started Purple Shoots in response to sort of looking at the poverty in the world at large to start with, but then locally where I was in Wales, and sort of thinking, why, saying to God, why don't you do anything about it? And I felt really strongly that he was saying to me, I gave you responsibility, you do something. So Purple Shoots is what I did to try to sort of address the poverty that I saw around me in Wales. But there are lots of, I've meant to look them out before I started this and I forgot, but there's lots of numbers about how many verses there are in the Bible that talk about God's concern for the poor and God's wanting his people to do something about it. And it was Jesus also talked about it a lot all through the Gospels. So there's a lot of spiritual inspiration behind what Purple Shoots does. And the sort of practical reasons for doing this, I think the figures in Wales are very similar to the UK figures. I had access to the Welsh figures, but this slide here just shows the value of small businesses. SMEs are small and medium-sized enterprises. The value of those to the economy. They're a really undervalued part of the UK economy. The micro businesses, which are businesses that employ fewer than 9 people, many of them were almost entirely overlooked in the support packages that came out throughout the COVID epidemic. Huge numbers of our borrowers were forced to go back onto benefits because they couldn't get any support for their business. Actually, there was a great injustice there because a lot of our borrowers can't get business accounts from a bank, so they have to run the business through a personal account. And when you claim benefits, they take into account what's in your personal bank. And so money that they'd put on one side to pay rent, to pay their tax at the end of the year, that was all, they couldn't get benefits until all that was spent. So, that was outrageously unjust. But anyway, but micro businesses are overlooked by policymakers, and the value of they're completely undervalued. I think you when they discuss economic issues on the news, on the TV, they always consult the CBI, which represents all the big businesses, and the micro businesses, which provide so much employment and so much value to our local economies, are usually overlooked. This is just a quick slide to show you the problem, or at least with a solution here. So the dark is the most deprived areas in Wales, and the green dots are our lending, and there's a big correlation on that map. Similarly, this is the bank lending. Again, the dark is where all the bank does the most of its lending, which tends to be in the wealthier parts of Wales, and the green dots are where we do our lending, where nobody else will do it. And when we get cracking on the rest of the UK, the pattern will be the same. So if you are poor, you have to cope with these sort of attitudes in the UK. It's funny, there's a lot more sympathy for people who are poor in the rest of the world than there is in the UK. But this isn't me, this is a report by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, a study that they did into attitudes of the wider population towards people on benefits. And this is what they think. And in that report, it roundly sort of rules out these as actually factual. The only thing I can remember from it, the statistic I can remember, is the one that says that everybody's poor has a huge family. If there's only 8% of families on benefit who've got more than 2 children. So there's lots of myths around about people who are poor, and it sort of compounds their problem of trying to change things for themselves when they want to, because they've got to overcome this prejudice that's against them, that the media doesn't help with all its the benefit street and some of those things, which those people are not people that we meet. The people we meet are all trying to change their situation. But if you are poor and you want to raise money to start a business, these are the issues that you'll come across. That stigma that I mentioned, when you're struggling on benefits and you've been out of work for some time, your confidence is at a low ebb. You feel unvalued, as if you've got nothing to contribute, all those sort of things. If you've been in work and then you lose your job, the spiral down into poverty can be quite fast, because you may have had commitments that you took on when you had a job that you can't meet once you've lost it and they're trying to live on benefits, and then you get a poor credit score, and then and so it goes on down. And then when you want to try to change anything, all the normal people, the banks, even some of the government schemes, they won't support someone who's got a full credit score and has got defaults on their commitments, even if they couldn't help doing it. So they end up with those people in the middle of the slide, the illegal lenders, who are flourishing at the moment, and the high cost credit providers. There are fewer of those now, but they are still out there. So I thought I'd tell you a story, and just to illustrate the issues that people face. This is Ruth. Ruth is one of our borrowers. She had a job, and then she had a long-term health condition, and in the end had to give up her job because of her health, and very quickly spiraled down into debt and struggling. She couldn't, the benefits aren't that she was able to claim weren't enough to cover the commitments she had. She had to borrow to survive. It was very expensive debt, and so on. But as she recovered her health, she developed a skill in making artisan soap, and thought perhaps she could make a business around that that would enable her to, that she could work around her health issues. So she started to look for funding. She couldn't find any. We provided the funding for her. She now has a really flourishing business. She employs at least one other person that I know of, possibly more than that now. She's got a manufacturing facility of her own, an outlet. She sells online, she sells into hotels and corporates. She's doing really well, and she's personally debt-free. So, and we have, quite a lot of stories of people like that. I put a few people up here. I must make sure I don't rabbit on and waste all the time, but just very quickly, Trevor's the one in the mask there. Trevor has MS, so he's in a wheelchair, but he runs a small business, and he designed these masks during the epidemic, and we provided some funding so that he could produce them en masse and sell them, and he actually paid us back early because he did so well with them. They are compliant with all the rules, but you can lip read through them. That was what he developed them for. But I've got his picture up here because he lives fairly independently as a carer to help him work, because he has limited mobility now. And recently, the DWP decided to review his benefits. He has personal independence payments in order to pay his carer. When they do that, they stop the benefits. So he had to contact me and say, actually, I'm not going to be able to make your loan repayments because my benefits have stopped and I can't pay my carer. And that's just a very demeaning position to put somebody in who's making a business work. And totally unnecessary, because they could review the benefits while still paying him and then adjust them if they had to after. I have lots of stories of people like that. So the fisherman, that isn't Wesley, but I did fund a fisherman called Wesley, but I haven't got a picture of him. And he was one who'd saved up a lot of money to buy a fishing boat and start a fishing business. And then he was working at the time, but then he had I think it was an injury and wasn't able to work, but he couldn't claim benefits until all that money he'd saved had gone. And so then we did fund him, and he's fine now. But there's a lot of injustices in the benefit system, which could be changed to help people who are poor actually make a go of the businesses and be more likely to succeed and more likely to try. That group, that's one of our self-reliant groups at the bottom. I put that up a little. I was going to mention it later, but as the picture's there, I'll mention it now. We've done quite a bit of work with in partnership with churches, and this group is a lovely story in that we used a church building. We just hired their hall to run the group, and they're not all there, but most of the group are single mums with children, and of course, and we hired this hall, and the meeting was really chaotic because they came with all the children, and we were trying to sort of work with them and develop the skills and do all the things we normally do in the groups with hordes of children tearing around. We brought toys, we brought stuff to entertain them, but it was quite a problem. And then the pastor of the church said to us, I don't want to be pushy, but would you like us to run a children's club whilst your group's running? So I said, yes, we would, thank you very much. So they started a little children's club for the children of the women. But within a couple of weeks, there was a queue outside that church when we arrived of all the children from the community who also wanted to join in with this children's club. And it gave the church the opportunity to run services for the children and to invite the mums along. It was a great opportunity for the church, and it was also great for us, because our group then became successful because the distraction of the children was removed. These are three more of our people. I was going to tell their stories. I've got time. Maybe I'll just tell Julie's. Julie was a single mum who she was working as a legal, what was her title? She was not a solicitor, but a legal something or other. Anyway, a good job with good money. And then her marriage broke down, and she had children, and she couldn't get childcare to enable her to do her job. So she had to give up the job and work at sort of low paid sort of part-time jobs to try to make ends meet and build around her childcare, which led to a spiral down into poverty. She lost her home, she couldn't make the mortgage repayments, a real awful tale. And when we met her, she was at a really low ebb, but she had a very clever business idea, and we supported her through it. The business is thriving now, and she started what's called the Single Mums Business Network, which is now a UK-wide support network for women, for single mums who want to start businesses, to try to avoid them getting to the point of difficulty that she got to. So I'm sort of telling you these stories because it's to dispel the myths around people who are poor, and to show the difference that a very small amount of money can make to help people off the ground and into a better position. Emma was another. There's two Emmas there, but I'm worried about running out of time, so I won't tell you their stories, but I could tell them after. This slide I put up usually for policymakers to suggest things that they can do, but we can campaign for some of these things to happen. So there are some changes in the benefit system that could happen to make things easier for people to try business ideas and for them to work. You may have heard of the cut-off in the benefit system. So when people in the universal credit, when people on universal credit start a business, when they start, as soon as they earn over a very small amount of money, it's something like £200 a month, their benefits are cut by it was 63 pence in every pound, it's now 57 pence in every pound, but effectively they're no better off for maybe a couple of years before the business is earning enough to replace the benefits. And in that time, the business is very vulnerable and might fail. And then we're all back to square one. We've lost our money, they've lost their business, they're back on full benefits. And if the benefits cut away more gently, that wouldn't happen. So I'm always tweeting and emailing people about the benefit system, which is great on the whole, but if it was tweaked a little bit, it would help more people move into starting a small business. The other things policymakers can do is make advice more available for people. There's some great charities out there providing debt advice, but they're not widely known, and there's not enough of them. And the other thing they could do is protect your education. But I wanted to add on here maybe quickly what churches might be able to do, because of, as I mentioned, the little story of where we've worked with churches with our groups. We're quite keen to do that with more churches, and there is a progression of the groups. They can just host a group, or they can support a group, or if the group has entrepreneurial people within it, there are bound to be, or there may be, church members who would like to mentor them or help them along the road, especially retired people who have, well, in theory, have time and maybe and probably have the right sort of skill set in terms of being able to relate to people who are struggling through business. So there is quite a bit that churches could do if they want to work with us. And as I say, we're keen to work around the UK. So I put this quote up. I hope you can see it. Because it was the man who said it, who was a very respected economist, and he is sort of saying, he's sort of agreeing with John Wesley in a way that people should be supported to support themselves, which is what we're doing, and sort of confirming that that it sort of fits with what modern sort of social science thinking is, that enabling people to do it for themselves rather than sort of a top-down approach to people is what really makes a difference. And I often finish, I think this little quote sums up really what we're trying to do. You will know the phrase, give a man a fish and he eats for a day, teach a man to fish and he eats for a lifetime. But I would say that in our context, that man already knows how to fish, and what he needs is money to buy a rod and an opportunity to try. And that's what Purple Shoots provides. So I hope that's given you a flavour of what we do, and also perhaps a sort of some ideas around some of the issues that the poorest people in our communities come up against, and the difference that a small amount of money can make to enable them to earn all they can so that they can save and eventually, hopefully, be able to give. Although I have to say that the people we work with who are the poorest in the communities around us are often the most generous and the kindest. So thank you, and I hope there's some questions.
Karen, thank you so much. I've learned so much in the last 20 minutes. I'm incredibly inspired by what you're doing, and I immediately want to ask lots of questions of you and of Gary. Just to remind all the attendees that there is an opportunity to ask some questions now of Gary and Karen. And if you would like to ask the question, please can you type your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will start looking at those in a minute. We'll give you a couple of minutes to think of a question and put into the Q&A box. But Gary, I was just wondering how.
Well, I was going to say, while Karen was talking there, I was thinking how much Wesley would have agreed with everything that she said, really. I mean, he hated the fact that people kept saying that the poor were undeserving, or that they were idle, or it was their fault, that everything was their fault, that they weren't in the situation that we're in. And he spent a lot of his time trying to instill back into the poor a sense of their worth, that everybody has a real, genuine worth. And he felt very much, if you could instill that sense of worth, that you have a value, then you did actually start to try and make a difference yourself. And what Karen was saying about communities helping themselves is exactly what he was trying to encourage to do. He was very much a bottom-up transformer of society rather than a top-down. And as far as poverty was concerned, I mean, he really just said there are 4 things that generate poverty. He said the first is human greed, because it actually encourages people to exploit other people. So it's exploitation. is one factor. The other factor is that a lot of people who work don't have an adequate income from the work that they do. In other words, we should be having a proper living wage. Quite remarkable, in the 18th century, he was talking about a living wage then. Thirdly, unemployment as a huge cause of poverty. And I was saying before the program started to Karen, I mean, he did exactly what Purple Shoots was doing. He set up opportunities to employ people. He gave loans to people who had ideas for businesses to try and create work. And again, this wasn't profit making. They paid back the money that he'd given them, but that was it. But it was an attempt to generate employment, which he felt was so important if we were trying to tackle the issues of poverty. And then finally, actually, the other thing he thought was a great contributor to poverty was the assumption that whatever you did made no difference. And actually, he was a great believer that actually whatever you did made a difference. However small it might be, it made a difference. And he was a great encourager of people to say, don't worry about, just look at the situations you're involved in and do what you can in those. You can make a difference to the people around you. Even if you don't feel you can solve things globally, you can make a real difference. And I think that combination of giving people a sense of their worth and giving other people a sense of that actually what they did could really make a big difference was one of the factors why he was able to make such a big change in the 18th century.
Thank you, Gary. So we do have a question in the Q&A box from Wendy, who, this is for you, Karen. How do you get the funds that you lend? Do you have partners who give you money to lend? Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's always a big headache. We have accreditation for a tax relief scheme called Community Investment Tax Relief, which means that investors can lend us money, which we can then use on lend, and they get tax relief for doing that. Obviously, we have to pay them back eventually, but that's one source of our capital. But we have to match that with some sort of donated or grant money, because we don't make any money. In fact, we lose money. So because we don't charge enough interest to cover other costs of doing it and the costs of what we lose. I mean, not every business succeeds and not everybody can pay us back. The majority do, but there are losses. And a normal lending company, I mean, there was a reason why Wonga charged 400%. They were trying to make money, but even just to break even, we would need to charge probably twice as much as we're charging, maybe more. And I feel like that would disadvantage our borrowers even more. So whilst that's an option if we start to fail to raise donated money, but so far we've been able to raise donated money. I'm always lobbying government to support us because we save the government so much money, but so far without success. But yeah, so it's a mix of borrowed money from investors and donated money from wherever we can get it, really.
And you were saying earlier about the Welsh Government and speaking to the Welsh Government, are these ideas starting to be noticed a bit more by people who can make a difference, who people in power? Are people starting to sit up and notice what you're doing?
There is an element of that. In fact, weirdly, since we started working over the border in England, that's made a bit of a difference. That people, I think, whilst we were a little tiny charity just in South Wales, we could be sort of sidelined, but now we have a little bit more of a voice. So I hope so. I hope that we're being. I mean, there certainly is a little bit more interest in supporting us in government circles. I don't know quite whether it will come to something, but I'm hoping. I think there's interest now following COVID and all this levelling up agenda, because we're so exactly what they want, if only they would see it. I think I'm wearing them down.
We have another question from David. David, I hope that I reflect your question accurately. He says, how good an idea is it for individuals to loan money if they know of a business venture in need of help? I'm just trying to unpack that a little bit. David, I don't know if you can clarify that question a little bit. I think he's saying, is it a good idea to lend people money if there is a good business venture in front of you? Do you mean as an individual? Yes, I think so. I'm a little bit confused as to what the actual question is there. I don't know if either of you can.
I mean, I would say that there's nothing wrong with doing that. If you charge interest, you run the risk of being an illegal lender, so don't do that. But
sure.
But if you lend it and just expect the person to repay you the amount that you've lent, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you don't mind losing it if the business doesn't work out. And I've seen lots of friendships fail when friends lend to friends, and things don't go to plan. So that's a risk. But I mean, one of the things we're suggesting to churches, if they want to go all the way and start lending money to entrepreneurs, is that we could manage the fund. If they set up a fund, we could manage it for them because we've got the right permissions to do it. But that's
sure. I get what you're trying to say, kind of like having a framework and the expertise around that money being lent, maybe. Okay.
And then we would take the risk then if it was lost. That's what we say with all our investors. They lend us the money, but it's never linked to they're always interested in who's had the money, but we just give them an overview of lots of the businesses, because if you tie it to one business and that business fails, then that investor loses his money, and that's
Okay. Gary, you were earlier you said that you were going to offer a couple of stories
about Wesley,
about how he personally
the most obvious thing to say, I mean, Wesley was actually a very high earner because he got into the business of selling lots of his brother's hymn books and lots of other publications. He actually increasingly, as time went on, became a very high earner. And his annual income by the end of his life was about 1,400 a year. Now that's when a single man could live comfortably on £30 a year, and he was earning 1,400 a year. So he was a wealthy man in terms of income. Now, if most people's income goes up, they tend to spend more money on themselves. Now, when Wesley was earning £30 a year, he lived on 28. That was what he had to spend to live on, and he gave away £2. When his income rose to £60 a year, he still lived on 28 and he gave away £32. When he had £120 a year, he just retained the 28 and he gave the rest away, and so on and so on and so on. And that's what he meant by, it's not our standard of living that should increase, it's our standard of giving. And he set that personal example. We see pictures of Wesley and the picture, we forget how unusual he looks because he's not wearing a wig. And in the 18th century, all men of his birth, gentle birth, would have had wigs. Wesley wouldn't wear a wig because he saw that as wasted money which he could give to more useful purposes. So even his hair is a kind of statement about his approach to things. And it was recognized in his lifetime. And when he died, in the obituaries, one of the obituaries that appeared in the national press about Wesley was said that he only left in his will £10. And they said that is remarkable. They couldn't think of any famous person who had so little money. And they said it bore witness to the fact that he'd lived and died exactly according to the way in which he preached. His journey on that, if you look at his accounts, his journey on that starts with a very personal story when he's a student at university. And he has this nice new room at university, and he decides he's going to make it really nice, and he gets his money and he spends to buy these lovely pictures to hang up in his room. And then he's served a meal by a girl whom he knows. He's met her in the town, but she's not wearing proper clothes on. It's very cold weather and she's got very flimsy clothes. She's clearly malnourished. And he puts his hand in his pocket, thinking, I better give this poor woman something, and realizes he's got nothing to give her because he just spent it all on all the paintings to hang up in his room. And that's a kind of turning point for him to say, well, you know, I haven't been thinking enough of other people. I've just been thinking about what I wanted. And that happened very early on in his life, really.
And Karen, was there a turning point for you? Was there one particular incident that inspired you to set up Purple Shoots, or was it a culmination of many things?
There was a negative push almost in that I'd worked in the financial services industry for most of my life, and it was very unsatisfactory because it's so profit driven, and I was always turning people away who I could see had a good business idea, but because they didn't have money to put in, or they had a bad credit score, the companies that I worked for wouldn't support them, and I was increasingly frustrated with that. And I kind of, I don't know why. My one regret is that I left it so late to start Purple Shoots. I should have done it 10 years beforehand. Should have been braver. But anyway, I'm sure it was God's timing. But there was a moment when I was in the office with all the people that I was working with in the company I worked for, and I could see how much they loved what they were doing. They really enjoyed it. And I thought, I really don't love this. This is really not where I want to be. And I think that's what, and I knew about the poverty in Wales, and I sort of had been praying a lot about it. And I think there was that moment when I felt God was saying, well, you know, you've got these, you know all this, do something about it, you know. And what I've done in the past in the financial services industry and in various other things, it was a sort of a weird career, but it all makes sense now that I'm doing this, because all the stuff that I learned along the way really fits with what I'm doing now. And I must say I identify with Gary's comment about the joy in serving other people in this way, because, you know, it's not a sort of a high-powered job that I had when I worked at the city, and, you know, people don't look up to me like that. It's difficult, and I don't earn very much money and all that sort of thing. But the joy of being able, the privilege of seeing people transformed just by me doing a little assessment of their loan and issuing a check, you know, it's just tremendous. And so yeah, that's changed. It has changed me, I think, as well as them.
Thank you for sharing your personal experience of what this has meant, or it still means to you. I've just realised that there's another question that I've missed asking you, and I think this one is for Karen, from an anonymous attendee. Credit unions offer personal loans. Do microfinance offer the same? Are the two synonymous?
They are similar. So yes, credit unions do offer personal loans. Most credit unions don't offer a loan for someone to start a business. So I work quite closely with some of the credit unions in Wales who will pass me people, and vice versa. They have an issue with people who are poor with a poor credit score, because they're based on people's savings, and so they can't risk lending. So there are other microfinance providers who do personal loans, but they are really quite expensive. They are ethical, but they're still quite expensive. But that is an issue that's out there at the moment, that there's this government body called Fair for All Finance are trying to tackle with dormant assets money, and they're trying to make to help that sort of lending to be more affordable. They haven't done it yet, but they're working on it. So that I think credit unions are a form of microfinance, but they still tend to lend to slightly better off people than the really needy ones at the bottom.
Thank you very much for explaining that. Do you know what? That hour has gone so quickly, and we are actually out of time already. So I think that will be our last question this evening. Gary and Karen, on behalf of John Wesley's New Room and the Learning Network Southwest, a huge thank you for taking part in this Wes Talk this evening. We've so appreciated two very different approaches to the question, but fascinating, and it's been amazing to see how those two things fit together, all those experiences fit together. Just a couple of things to say before we end. This talk is being recorded, and so it's going to be slightly edited and placed as a digital download in the New Room's online shop, which can be accessed there should be a link that's coming up in the chat box. There it is. So people can buy a download and share it with others if they would like to do that. If you know anybody who hasn't been able to join us this evening and you would like to pass it on to them or recommend it to them, then please do. Wes Talks is going to be taking a break for a while after tonight, so please keep an eye on the John Wesley's New Room website for future talks and events that we're going to be planning later in the year. You can also sign up to our newsletter via the website, which also should be coming up in the chat box, which is newroombristol.org.uk. The New Room Museum is also now open for visits and specially led tours, so that people can come to sites and discover more about how Wesley's words and actions empowered individuals and include themes of social justice and action. So Karen, whenever you're free, please do come and see us. And you can come and see how Wesley's themes of social justice have been interwoven through the museum. And yes, Gary, maybe you can come and give Karen a tour sometime. It would be fascinating to get you both together, not on a screen. Thank you everyone, to our attendees, for coming this evening. This is the end of the talk, so please do click leave if you are an attendee. And Gary and Karen, please could you stay on screen for just a few moments. Thank you very much, everyone.